Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the British effects in India, right? We were beginning to talk about and getting into the concept of the British and their effects on Indian culture and Indian classes, and actually how it led to violent revolts in India during their imperialistic movements in the late 1800s, right? So going into it, we left off in class talking about the deepening of this thing called the caste system, though, right? So basically the British came along and to try and make themselves feel good, they basically deepened a social class system that would lead to economic repression and economic suppression of Indians against other Indians going forward, right? So for those of you who don't know what the caste system is it's heavily related to Hindu culture and also to reincarnation, right? So there was these different classes, all right, within different areas of India, right? And they all had different ones, right? And all these different regions of India and all these different principalities and states that were ruled by those Rajas might have had a little bit different variations of this, and it was used to try and explain the idea of reincarnation, right? So if you were born, for example, in this class, the warrior class, right, the Kshitras, and if you literally led a very good life according to Hindu ideas, is you would then actually die, and then one day when you would be reborn as another person, you might bump up a class depending on how good of a life you led, right? And then vice versa, if you led a bad one, you might end up going down, right? All the way down to the bottom right here, which is of these people called the Dalits, or also referred to as the Untouchables, and they were like outcast street sweepers and people who were only allowed to touch like dirty things, right? Well, the thing about it though is that by the point that, or by the time that the British had showed up, it wasn't nearly as rigid anymore, and most Indians had began to go away from it. But the thing about it though is that the British came in and they actually kind of reinforced it because they were like, ooh, class systems, counting things. We love that as Western Europeans, right? They show up and they actually deepen the entire thing, helping them rule more aggressively and making the entire system actually really, really sketchy. And we'll expand on that a little bit in class when I see y'all soon, okay? But going into it, though, also, they're going to ban this other thing called sati, right? Which is then basically just virtue signaling because they got rid of this old practice called sati. And what sati was is when a man would die, his wife was then going to jump on top of his funeral pyre and kill herself with him, right? Now, some of you are like, but Mr. Terry, I'm confused. I feel like getting rid of this would be a good thing, you know, because women shouldn't have to burn themselves to death on top of giant bonfires, right? And I agree. I do agree with that. But the thing about it, though, is that the British got rid of this even though it was basically never practiced anymore. Like, most Indians didn't do it at all, and if they did, they were in very small areas, and it's not really up to you to tell people what they do or don't do with their cultural stuff. And the British were just doing it so they could put it in their newspapers and be like, oh, look what we got rid of, helping them out. It's a good thing we're here. No, it's not. It's way worse that you're there, right? Going into it, though, also, they're going to begin to destroy natural forests, and this is where we get into that stuff where the British really had a direct negative impact on the Indian people. They destroyed natural forests and deforested huge swaths of India so they could build railroads and farms to grow cash crops like cotton and tea and opium, right? Well, the thing about it, though, is if you're growing things like cotton and tea and opium, things that people can't eat, if there's ever like actually a famine or a drought or crop failure, it's going to lead to widespread famine, which it did multiple times because of Britain's actions in India and taking up that land to grow cash crops rather than food, right? Now, another big one, though, right here is going to be called the drafting of sepoys, right? So sepoys, what they were, are Indian soldiers that were actually forced to serve in the British military. They were not asked to do this. They took able-bodied young Indian men and forced them to serve in the British military, right? And the thing about these sepoys, though, is they're going to end up being forced to go fight in conflicts in China. They're going to be forced to go fight during World War I, and they never wanted to go to these places nor asked to go to these places. But also what's going to end up leading to is this thing called the Sepoy Mutiny, right? And the Sepoy Mutiny was in 1857 when all these guys decided to get together and hold a massive revolt because of the weapons that they were issued, right? And the reason why, or where this all came from, you might want to write this down because it's a big fat fill-in-the-blank question on your test, is because all of these sepoys were given the same weapon. They were given this thing right here, the 1853 Enfield rifle, right? The thing about this rifle is it's a musket. Now, why would the British, who have very much more technologically advanced guns, give muskets that take forever to reload and fire to all the Indian sepoys? That's exactly right. They gave it to them because they thought that they wouldn't be able to stage a revolt with these more primitive style weapons. Well, they were wrong, right? Because what ended up happening is a rumor spread throughout all the sepoys at one point in 1857, and what ends up happening is that rumor said that these bullet packs that they were giving them were actually sealed shut with animal fat, right? Now, it wasn't true. It was actually sealed shut with like a soapy-like substance called tallow and stuff like that, but a rumor had gone around that cow and pig fat have been used to seal these things shut, right? Well, the thing about it is y'all, for those of you who don't know, is that like you have to actually stick these things in your mouth, right? And you can actually see some of the dried adhesive right there on the end. You have to stick them in your mouth to rip them open and then pour everything in there and ramrod it down. Well, the thing about it though is y'all, Hindus do not believe in eating cows because it is a sacred animal to them. And then on top of it, Muslim Indians did not believe in touching or imbibing anything to do with pork because they thought they were disgusting animals. So there were dietary restrictions according to their religions. Well, the thing about it is the Indian soldiers were like, I'm not sticking this in my mouth anymore, man, because I heard a rumor going around that it's sealed shut with those animal fats. And what happens is the British were basically like, do it or we'll shoot you. And then the Indians got together and they were like, no, how about there's a way more of us because that indirect rule thing you've been using, how about there's way more of us, so how about we all jump you at the exact same time? And that's exactly what they did. And a widespread rebellion that took 2 years to suppress swept the entire continent of India, the subcontinent of India, and led to the widespread crushing of this revolt, because when the British show up with a very advanced military, they crushed the revolt and killed over 200,000 people, right? And then literally executed their leaders with this really screwed up thing called the blowing of the gun, which we'll talk about in class, right? They also are going to force Christian practices on Hindus and Buddhists, which makes no sense because that's not their faith, right? And so going into it, though, we're now going to begin to talk about, though, that, like, is that what's going to happen, though, or while we're leaving, we're like India in that location, or what kind of in that, like, ethos right there, is due to the fact that the British don't leave India until 1847, which is absolutely ridiculous, right? So they're going to stay there and keep infringing upon those Indians' rights and doing all those things for a long time, actually for over 100 more years, right? Or nearly 100 more years. Now, going into it, though, we're now going to stitch in another flip where we're going to talk about the Europeans in Africa and talk about that, how it led to genocide and how it led to the widespread takeover of Africa as well. Africa, right? So look right here real quick. We're changing up our title again. We're now moving into the Europeans in Africa, right? So the biggest thing that we have to discuss is the fact that, number one, the Europeans have been in Africa for quite some time, right? The Europeans have actually been there setting up several different systems, including the slave trade system that actually happened on the western coast of Africa going back as soon as the 1500s, set up by the Portuguese. We talked about also how they were actually trying to navigate around Africa, trying to get past the Cape of Good Hope and also get to Indian spices. So Europeans have been there for quite some time. But the thing about it is that they want to now explore the parts of Africa that they've never actually charted, right? Now, if you look at this map of Africa during, I believe this is around 1870-ish, right? So this is actually where European spheres of influence were in Africa and contact in Africa. Look at it all being around the coastline. Well, Africa is going to go from looking like that to looking like this, right? Having all of its lands claimed by European powers and things like that. Reason why is because the Europeans want to actually discover, not discover because people already live there, want to try and explore and take over the interior of Africa, right? And they're going to use a lot of disgusting and nefarious tactics to do so, right? So going into it, the interior was believed to be full of raw materials. They believed that things like petroleum, diamonds, gold, things like that were going to be inside the interior of Africa. Now, they didn't find as many precious metals as they thought they would. They did find a lot of diamonds in South Africa, but the interior of Africa is going to be home to a lot of things like palm oil, rubber, and other kind of naturally occurring substances as well. Now, a quick review. If Europeans had been in Africa since the 1500s, why are they only exploring the interior during the 1800s now? Like, why is it taking them so long? A lot of it has to do with that quinine medicine, right? With their new technologies, Europeans now have the ability to explore the interior of Africa and not die from malaria, right? So the biggest thing when we're looking at it is we're now talking about the aspects of European growth because their imperialist colonies, go ahead, buddy. Their imperialist colonies are growing now because they have quinine medicine to kind of try and prevent the growth of the malarial diseases that will kill the explorers. And they also have things like steamboats and stuff like that that actually have a low berth, which means that they will actually be able to navigate some larger rivers. So the thing about it, though, also is that they're going in there with military technologies that will make them 100% unstoppable, which is absolutely terrifying and absolutely disgusting. Now, the thing about it, though, is after several different explorers actually went into Africa, you got people like David Livingstone, you got Cecil Rhodes, you also have people like Henry Morton Stanley, these other people that are going to actually start navigating some of these rivers after the advent of quinine medicine and start trying to find places like the source of the Congo, and then also trying to actually spread missionary things and things like that, are going to start kind of pushing their way into Africa. There's going to be this thing known as a scramble for Africa. When Europeans realize that they actually can navigate these different rivers and actually go in there and find resources like ivory, rubber, palm oil, petroleum, different elements of different raw material elements like that, it's going to lead to what's known as that scramble for Africa, right? Now, scrambling as in like a race, okay? Like as in they are trying to see if they can get what they can get to, what lands they can claim for their own countries and things like that by this time. This phrase that refers to the late 1800s race for African territory is often known as the scramble for Africa. Now, by the 1884, to try and prevent things from getting out of hand and trying to prevent war from actually going on over land that they don't even own, which is ridiculous to even say, you know what I mean? Like that Europeans got together and had a meeting so they didn't go to war over land that they were unlawfully stealing from other people, right? In 1884, the Berlin Conference would be held, right? Which was a meeting in Berlin, which was the capital of the German Empire, to split up the territory in Africa, and not a single African person was actually invited, right? Now, the man who led that conference is none other than Otto von Bismarck, right? Otto von Bismarck can be seen right here actually splitting up this cake, which of course is labeled Africa, right, with other Europeans around the table. By 1904, the entire continent of Africa was going to be owned completely by Europeans. Now, something else that we need to understand really, really quickly is that the Europeans that are arriving in these different areas by this point are actually coming in with military technology that Africans had no ability to stop, and the people that they're actually taking over are tribal society Africans. Sub-Saharan Africans during this time period were still tribal in setup, right? Many of them didn't have written languages. Many of them actually kind of operated much more on traditional values, and also some were even at the time still semi-nomadic, right? So the thing about it is much like the Native Americans in the United States, this land would be taken from them using a lot of nefarious tactics. But no situation was nearly as bad as the Belgian conquest of the Congo, right? So this right here is a man by the name of Leopold II, okay? Leopold II to Central Africans is considered the worst human being in history, right? Leopold II was the king of Belgium. He was a constitutional monarch. He didn't like the fact that he didn't have complete overarching power, right? So he wanted to try and get in on what was going on in Europe, and he wanted to try and claim some more territory for himself, right? And so he eyed up one central little spot in the area in the middle of Africa right here. It's this yellow chunk right there. That's what King Leopold wanted, and it's known as the Congo, right? He actually sent Henry Morton Stanley, an explorer, to go and explore this area to try and find the source of the Congo River. The Congo River is a very wide, large thoroughfare that they could use to actually put boats up and down, put railroads around it and stuff like that. Well, that's what Leopold wanted. And so he actually went to this Berlin conference meeting, and he actually got that area, right? Now, what he's going to do is usher in a reign of terror like no other. So, literally what it was called, so whenever he went there, the original resource that he wanted was ivory, right? Because it was worth a lot of money. And then later on, that's going to change in the late 1800s, and the Belgians are going to start trying to harvest rubber from there as much as possible. Now, the thing about it is, though, is that literally this rule, Leopold's rule in Central Africa, in the Congo, would actually lead to the death of 10 million Africans, right? 10 million people over the course of the Belgian conquest of the Congo. And it was in disgusting manners, right? He would apparently his forces would make other tribal Africans harvest rubber by taking their family members hostage. They also created an indirect military force known as the Force Publique, where they recruited other Africans to actually suppress other Africans by giving them guns and weapons to try and force the other Africans to go off and actually farm and harvest this rubber as well. Now, the crazy screwed up part about it, and the symbol that is very well known about this Belgian conquest of the Congo, is that every time a Force Publique soldier would fire a weapon, they would have a spent cartridge, right? A cartridge that showed that they had shot a weapon. And then so what ended up happening is literally the Force Publique soldiers would have to bring back proof that they shot a human with it, that they didn't actually shoot an animal with it. So oftentimes what would happen in the Belgian conquest of the Congo is the Force Publique soldiers would harvest hands from other living human beings to try and show that they actually had shot a person, not an animal. But the thing about it is more often they were shooting animals because they're Sub-Saharan Africans that were raised in tribal societies. They wanted to use those guns to hunt, not actually suppress people and stuff like that. So you have to understand that the Belgian conquest of the Congo is actually considered something on genocide levels, okay? So the thing about it when we're looking at it, you have to understand that the scramble for Africa and that example right there just demonstrates to us that there are going to be massive societal effects of imperialism. Do you see what I'm talking about right here? Look at what I'm zooming in on right now. Focusing on these societal effects of imperialism, we just talked about one, right? When the Belgians went into the Congo and destroyed this entire thing, genocide is a societal effect of imperialism, right? Also, when you're looking at societal effects, racism is going to be a massive societal effect as well. So going into this understanding, these are very important that you understand, right? Because the major effects of imperialism are going to be widespreading, and are going to be very important, and I'm also going to be heavily testing you on them, right? So looking at this entire thing, revolts against European rule, of course, are actually going to happen. When we look at things like the Belgian conquest of the Congo as our example, by the way, really interesting little fact is that some people in Africa will actually name their children Adolf after Hitler because they've heard of a person that's taken over most of Europe and done all these things, and they think it sounds like a strong name, but the one name that nobody will ever name their child in Africa is Leopold because he's considered the level of Hitler to Africans as the level that the name Adolf is to people in Europe, right? So the thing about it, though, is revolts against European rule are gonna happen, right? When you are taking over people and stripping their land and resources from them unlawfully, revolts are gonna happen against European rule. We talked about this a little bit in class as well when we reviewed in our warm-up. We talked about the Taiping Rebellion in China. We talked about, actually, the Sepoy Mutiny in India. There's gonna be some in Africa as well that go down, and one particular instance was literally known when 5,000 sub-Saharan Africans made up of a conglomeration of Zulu tribesmen and other people are going to try to actually take over a military installation being held by 50 British guys and 4 Maxim guns. And not a single one of those 50 British men died. 4 Maxim guns were all they needed to suppress a group of 5,000 Africans. So what does that demonstrate to us? That the tribes and the groups of people that were taken over by the Europeans in the late 1800s had no ability to stop this movement. And then also what you're going to see as well is religions and social structures are going to fall apart. You're also going to see the growth of this thing known as paternalism and racism. Paternalism is a very racist ideology that actually popped up in the late 1800s where basically Europeans believed that they knew better of what these people needed than they actually themselves knew, right? So it's taking a paternalistic view, viewing them as if they are children and stuff like that, that needed European guidance at this point, right? And you can see the growth of paternalism and racism in 2 key examples that I have listed right here. One is actually a story that was written by a man named Rudyard Kipling. Now, Rudyard Kipling wrote this poem called The White Man's Burden, which is an example of paternalism. Now, this is a disgusting phrase, and I hate saying it, but this British guy basically wrote a poem saying, oh, it is the burden of Europeans to try and socialize and civilize people in other areas. That is absolutely ridiculous. It's flat out not true, and it's absolutely racist and insane, right? So, but that poem is very, very well known by the man who wrote, it, Rudyard Kipling. That guy also wrote another very famous book as well, The Jungle Book, where he implies that Indian people are closer to animals than they are closer to human beings. That's why Mowgli can talk to them. So, going into it as well, social Darwinism is also going to be a massive reaction to this as well. Now, for those of you who are in biology, you should know what this is already. Darwinism is the idea of evolution. The strongest will survive and things like that, which came out in the late 1800s as well. Charles Darwin published his book called The Origin of Species, right? And in The Origin of Species, he talks about natural evolution, the strongest will survive and stuff like that, which we now accept as scientific fact. But then he later on wrote another book called The Descent of Man, right? So in The Descent of Man, he talks about how he believed that Europeans were the most advanced race of human beings, which is ridiculous. And basically his ideas are going to be twisted, and social Darwinism will then be used to say basically that Europeans had the right to take these places over because they were more advanced, which is stupid, ignorant, and dumb. All right? So the biggest thing about it is that is where we're going to be wrapping everything up with this flip. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.